rushed to the aid of democratic Finland. But for them, Stalin's word was law. In Latin America, even Cuban Americans don't know that the largest, most successful communist party in Latin America was the Cuban Communist Party. And for more than 20 years, the Cuban Communist Party faithfully supported the leadership of the great national popular hero Fulgencio Batista, overthrown by Castro. But in every discussion I have with young people, even Cubans, the standard reaction is, America always supports the right-wing dictator. Batista was a hero to many of the poorest people, just like Castro, who followed him. In Argentina, the rule of General Perón, his greatest opponent was the American ambassador, and Perón used this in a tirade of anti-American rhetoric to win re-election. When we come to the Middle East, here's one of the greatest fabrications, ironies, and gross distortions of history you'll ever meet. The United States, if you heard Obama's speech in Cairo, or the testimony of people like Brennan, we are supposed to feel some kind of guilt in being on Israel's side, when the facts are indisputable that from Israel's struggle for survival in 1948, when it was attacked by 7 Arab armies, until President Kennedy in 1962, who sent a few low-grade weapons to Israel. The only supplies the United States provided to Israel in a military sense were uniforms. How did Israel win in 48? Relying on the support of the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia. The entire Israeli Air Force was Czech, built, delivered, smuggled with Soviet approval, including Soviet advisors, and the East European communist states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, allowed more than 200,000 Jews to reach Israel in the heat of battle, in the middle of the War of Independence. What did the United States and its State Department do? Imposed an immediate blockade which only affected the efforts of American Jews to smuggle weapons to Palestine. These are all facts that anyone can find out by reading contemporary reports. Okay, there are other chapters in the book, but I thought by throwing those at you, we could at least form a foundation to understand, first of all, why I wrote the book. I believe that it's imperative that we help our friends, our neighbors, and especially young people to be able to evaluate for themselves the reliability of information. All the time, on television particularly, but in the electronic media, we read all kinds of facts which are not facts. Talk about textbooks. I taught geography in Ocala. I didn't bring the book with me. It weighs about 7 or 8 pounds. Standard geography book. Geography, Realms, Regions, and Concepts by Harm de Blie and Peter Muller, both distinguished geographers, published by Wiley in 2007. This is one of the most widely used textbooks in American colleges, and its treatment of the Middle East and Islam is typical. Without the extreme bias in favor of Islam, such a book would not be acceptable in most American colleges today. This is the page that introduces Islam to students, entitled The Flowering of Islam. The conversion of a vast realm to Islam was not only a religious conquest. Okay, they mentioned the word conquest. The Muslims didn't belong there. Arabs and Berber tribesmen invaded the peninsula, conquered Spain and Portugal, and through their armed presence maintained their rule for something like 7 centuries. Muslim rule was also accompanied by a glorious explosion. You know any glorious explosions? In science, the arts, architecture, and other fields, Arab society far outshone European society. While the western remnants of the Roman Empire languished, Arab energies soared. Okay, I could go on and on. None of this has any relation to reality. Who wrote this? Okay, it could have been these 2 authors. It could have been any of the 100 names who are listed as contributors. But having lived abroad for 30 years, knowing 3 other foreign languages fluently, and I'm only talking about Spain, Denmark, and Israel, I have seen how the reliance on sources by journalists, by media personalities, is limited almost entirely to what has been written in English. And if you try and find where is the original source for this information, you're referred to another book written in English by some other expert, not to a contemporary account by an eyewitness, by an ear-witness, by a newspaper published at the time, of course in the original language. Americans are so used to seeing films that are dubbed that they think the whole world is dubbed in English. Okay. Here is the most recent comprehensive book on the Muslim presence and Spanish-Muslim relations by Spain's most distinguished historian. No doubt, even his opponents will say the most distinguished historian, the most reliable, is César Vidal. Here is his book published 5 years ago. España frente al Islam. Spain in the face of Islam, or confronting Islam. De Mahoma, from Mohammed to Bin Laden. Okay, it's 700 pages. On each page you can find footnotes to the original sources. Where did this information appear for the first time? Where you can go and find out eyewitness, ear-witness accounts, the chronicles of the church, of the kings, Muslim records, and read all of the information that was available at that time. Not comments, not third-hand sources. I will read the summary at the back. I'll give you a quick translation into English. Contrary to what has been established only recently by myth, namely the so-called Pacific living together, convivencia. Everyone has seen these lovely license plates, you know, with a cross, a crescent, a star. Maybe they throw in a Buddhist symbol, and it spells out, what does it spell? Coexistence. Isn't that lovely? Yeah. Okay. So, in spite of what has been established by these recent myths, such as the Pacific living together of the 3 religions, the relationship between Spain and Islam has been characterized by enormous tension that can be summed up in one word: violence. A phenomenon that extends from the first invasions of the 8th century, which annihilated the most flourishing culture of the West and subjected the greatest part of the people of Spain to a second-class citizenship to slavery and exile. That's the summary. And yet you can read the nonsense which our students who don't, I assume, even if they have 2 or 3 years of Spanish, aren't able to go to an original source and say, where's the evidence for this? This is the kind of stuff you see all over because of the reluctance of any educational institution to contradict the reality. Let me give one more example, this time from Denmark. I also recently wrote a book, and like the book on Spain, I only use sources taken from the original language. I lived in Denmark 7 years, and in 1995 I almost fell out of my seat when on this live broadcast celebrating the 50th anniversary of victory in Europe, the main commentator introduced the sister of the Queen of Denmark, whom he described as the granddaughter of King Christian X, who was King of Denmark during the wartime period, whom we all know, together with his family, put on the yellow star, the Jewish star, to express his solidarity with the Jewish population of Denmark. This is a total myth, never happened, yet it appears in quite a number of books. Just 6 months ago, the women who have this TV talk show, what's it called? The View. This was mentioned, and everyone celebrated this as if it were a fact. When I wrote to the head of the BBC and said, not only is this not true, you can pick up the phone and call the Danish embassy, but the Queen of Denmark, in her own autobiography, has recounted how embarrassed she has been. Now, her grandfather was not a hostile or evil person. On the contrary, he was he was in an extremely difficult position. He simply had to go along with what the German occupation ordered. And for 3 years, he broadcast appeals to the Danish people not to take up armed resistance against the occupation. But that was the policy of the politicians in his government. But she recounts how Jewish guests have complimented her for something her grandfather never did, to the point where she's embarrassed. And yet the BBC, 6 or 7 years ago, on its 75th anniversary, issued a huge brochure, and many of their most prominent producers and reporters claim that the BBC is the world's most reliable news-gathering agency in the world. They sent me a letter in which they, as I said, admitted the mistake, not calling it a mistake, saying they regret the inaccuracy. Inaccurate is to say that nitrogen is 76% of the atmosphere instead of the true 78%. That's an inaccuracy. But saying something happened that never happened is not an inaccuracy. Yeah, but they themselves didn't even know they were lying. Well, my book, The Left is Seldom Right, wasn't the bestseller. However, I'm enormously glad that I wrote it, particularly for comments I received from younger people, students. One you can go on Amazon and read from, he actually, not by name, but he identifies himself as a student at University of Southern Florida in Tampa. And he wrote, "Thank you so much for your book.